So, as you may know, the second Sunday of the month, we normally have Science Sunday after coffee, starting a little early today because we closed the service a little early. So today we're happy to have, hang on, what So we're happy to have Stephen Conn. He's a lone STEM professional from a family of musicians. While not a performing musician himself, he's a musical carnivore and an avid tinkerer of the intersection of music and science. Mr. Conn is currently a Linux and open source platform specialist at the National Institute for Science and Technology, or NIST, which you probably all know. So thank you, Steve. And if you have a question, wait for the microphone, because it's recorded, so you need to use the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Can you all hear me okay, or I don't know if I'm coming over the public address system or whether they're just recording me. A little higher, okay. All right, is that better? And better? All right, good. So good morning. My talk this morning, my title, I'm one of these people I generally tend to put things off to the last minute, and I did publish a different title for this talk, which Michael put in the announcements, in which he talked about this morning. And in the process this last weekend of putting together what I was going to talk about, it occurred to me that that I may be pulling a little bit of a bait and switch on you in some ways. And I ended up kind of retitling my talk when I kind of understood what the focus of it, what I wanted the focus of it to be. So my new title is Sonogenesis, my own. I kind of coined the term for the creation of sound, or the genesis of sound. Robert Moog in the science of making music from scratch. And the reason I chose that title is that really this is not going to be a talk about music. I mean, as Michael said, you know, I'm not a musician. I come from a family of musicians. I married a musician. There she is out there in the audience. Shireen Ober, who is my wife, we're occasional members here at UUCR. You know, we are kind of working our way in here and are thinking at some point of becoming members, but at this point, we've been kind of occasional attendees. Well, you can pitch me later. And I married a musician. I grew up surrounded by music. Music is one of the main kind of passions of, you know, the artistic passions of my life, not in performance, but I am just, as Michael said, I'm an omnivore. I love it all. I went from being kind of a jazz and classical snob in my teens. I grew up to learning to understand and appreciate a lot of different kinds of music. As we got into the age where my kids were getting into country music on the one hand or rap and hip hop on the other, you know, something happened to me as a parent where I suddenly became interested and willing to kind of accept almost anything and listen to it. And so when I say I'm a music omnivore, that's why I say that. I'm also, but by profession, as Michael said, I'm basically a computer guy. I'm a journeyman computer guy working at a research laboratory, a federal research laboratory in Gaithersburg. So, Sonogenesis. So what I'm going to talk about today, and there will be a little bit of music in it, but I won't be performing it. But I'm mainly going to focus on what it is that Robert Moog made possible for music and musicians. So I guess I meant to go to that. That's me, my name, my email address, in case you'd like to contact me. So, introduction. So the music, I'm going to take a second and just put this back on for a second. I just want to play a few moments of it. So if you grew up, or if you were conscious, I guess, if you grew up or if you were living in the 1960s, you probably heard that music someplace or music like that someplace. I don't know, either I don't know, in the background at a high-end department store, as actually background for a television ad. Maybe you went to one of those, I don't know, new age weddings. Actually, if you were at my wedding, which was not in the 60s, but in the 1980s, you would have heard music like that. And the first thing, when you first heard the music, what first hits you is that it is familiar. It's J.S. Bach. It's the music of J.S. Bach. But as you listen to it, you realize that there's something very different about it, right? This is not the usual, this is the usual music of Bach. These are the notes, and the tempos and the chords. But instead of music, instead of sounds that are produced by the manipulation, by hands, human hands, of ivory and boxwood and brass and catgut, right, which is what we're used to hearing. These are sounds that don't sound like anything like what you would normally hear in nature. They seem completely new. So it's the same music, but it's played with completely new kinds of voices, right? And the ability to do that, the ability to create these new noises, was something I think that both in the 1960s drew a lot of people to classical music that weren't generally inclined to listen to it, but also that created interest among a lot of people who did not like listening or didn't think they were listeners to amplified or electronic music to start listening to it. And the album that music comes from, obviously, as we all know, is Switched on Bach. Now, Switched on Bach was the first classical album to ever sell 1 million copies, ever. And it still is one of the best-selling classical music albums of all time. Although now these days it's actually rather more difficult to get. You can't find it in a lot of record stores. Actually, there aren't many record stores anymore, but you can't. It's a difficult. But even as far as CDs are concerned, it can be difficult to get a hold of. And it features keyboard virtuoso Wendy Carlos playing a complicated musical instrument that you see in the background there, called a Moog synthesizer, which was conceived, developed, designed, engineered, and actually built by the gentleman up there on the left, Robert Moog. He's seen in that picture with another keyboard virtuoso who you may recognize as Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who was one of the early rock and roll musicians to actually tour and travel with Moog's synthesizer. As you can see, it was not an easy thing to transport. It was, and anybody if you've used an electronic keyboard or a synthesizer these days, you realize that if you think about what you do, if you want to go from a harp sound to a tubular bell sound or some other kind of sound, it's a matter of clicking like through a menu and pressing a couple of buttons. In order to change sounds on the early Moog synthesizers, you see all those little cables and things. I'll talk more about that later. But it was like a switchboard, right? You actually had to physically connect all of those things and fiddle with all of those knobs before you got anything. When that machine or when that behemoth arrived at your home or studio and you turned it on and pressed the keys, nothing happened until you did all that. And just one last bit of trivia, the initial ones came without a manual. Right? In fact, the first several that they sold, and they cost $10,000 to $20,000 in 1960. Probably more like what, $100,000 or $150,000 now. When you got one of those, they sent out an engineer. In a couple of cases, Bob himself, but they sent out an engineer from Bob Moog's factory and workshop to spend a week or two with you. So these things were not in super wide use. So anyway, Bob Moog, and I'm sorry, give me a second to catch up here. So, and I've recently read a biography of Bob Moog, and one of the things I think is interesting about Bob Moog, in reading his biography, made me think of another kind of technological innovator Steve Jobs, of the Apple, the co-founder of Apple Computer. And it's interesting, I mean, they were both very successful as innovators, right? Steve Jobs was actually fantastically more successful as a businessman than Robert Moog was. And I won't go into the reasons why that's true, but they shared, I think, a really important characteristic, and a characteristic that allowed them to kind of transcend being just technological innovators, right, to being the kind of innovators whose innovations actually transform worlds outside technology, and in particular in the arts. And I think that characteristic that made it possible for them to do that made Steve Jobs as successful he was at transforming the lives of, in particular, artists and musicians, but a lot of other people too, through Apple, through computer technology, and Robert Moog through the development of synthesizer technology. I think what they had in common was a relentless focus on the user experience, right? They were less interested, I think, in the actual nuts and bolts of how things actually worked. And actually, Bob Moog may have been, we'll talk about this later, he was more, I think, into that than Steve Jobs was. But I think both of them, what they were really focused on was trying to create something that changed the lives, methods, work, and output of, in particular, like I said, artists and creators. And I think that, that relentless, that focus on that drove them, at least in Bob's case anyway, Bob, whose passion in life, whose maybe his twin passions other than engineering and science, his twin passions were really music, because he was himself a musician. But I think more importantly, musicians. Bob Moog loved musicians. And I think that love of musicians was what led him to really develop his technological innovations along lines that he thought would open up an entire world of new possibilities for performing musicians who themselves weren't, engineers, scientists, or maybe even remotely interested in any of that. So anyway, what I'm going to talk about today is Bob Moog, and Bob Moog as the developer of a technology that, as I said, liberated musicians from the bounds of physical sound production, and put practicing musicians into a world where they could create almost any sound they wanted at all. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how sound works. That's the science piece of this. I'll talk a little bit about how sound works, and I'll talk a little bit about sound production and transmission technologies work. And I'll talk a little bit about how synthesizers work. And I'll play a few samples of things along the way. But really my focus today is not so much on the music, but what it is that Bob Moog created for practicing musicians that really kind of revolutionized the way they perform and the way we hear music. So I'm going to just take a brief detour here, partially because I think it's interesting. Electronic music didn't start with Bob Moog. Hold with me just a moment here. So yeah, electronic music didn't really start with Bob Moog. In fact, electronic music was around starting probably in the 1930s and 1940s, when it was actually in a kind of small artistic community evolving in a lot of ways, particularly in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so on the one hand, you had the electronic production of sounds for sound effects purposes. That's kind of one area, sound effects records and things like that. And then you had people who were making use of both electrical circuits, tape recorded samples and stuff like that to electronically create musical compositions. And that was what was kind of referred to as avant-garde electronic music at the time. But you really didn't have people who were trying to use electronic instruments to actually, other than a novelty context, to create, to play what we mostly recognize as music, what we mostly accept as music. An exception in terms of the availability of electronic instruments like that were designed for musicians is the theremin, and I'm not going to talk about that now because I'm going to talk about that in more detail later on, because that's kind of where Bob Moog's story starts. But I thought it might be kind of interesting to just take a few minutes and kind of give you an idea of, before Bob Moog, of what electronic music was and what it sounded like. So here, these four guys are early pioneers of electronic music in Europe and the United States. I think the upper left-hand corner is Morton Subotnick. To his right, John Cage, who did electronically enabled or performed or maybe realized, electronically realized music. Also worked in a lot of other areas too. In the lower left, you have Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who probably, other than Cage, is probably the most familiar. If any names are familiar to you, that probably is Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and John Cage. And then the lower right hand is Milton Babbitt, who did a lot of interesting work in combining electronic sounds with human voices and natural instruments. And I'm going to play just a couple of quick samples, just give you an idea of, if you went to an electronic music recital at, I don't know, Cornell or, there's some other school that had an electronic music program, this is the sort of thing you might have heard. This is Etude by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. Not easy to dance to, right? Or sing along with. Let's see. Now, I mentioned earlier John Cage. Now, John Cage is interesting because he combined electronically generated sounds with other kinds, with recorded music and with like live radio play to create some of his electronic compositions. This is part one of his electronic suite by John Cage. Can you all hear things? Can you hear this okay? Again, I'm not snapping my fingers. Here's Morton Subotnick is probably, of this group, Subotnick and Stockhausen are probably the two of this group who were doing the most, exclusively electronic music. Music was actually generated mostly by electrical circuits. This is part two of a piece by Morton Subotnick called Touch. And finally, this is the last example of a kind of a mixture of electronic music together with acoustic music. This is a piece for, I think it's soprano and some kind of electrical circuitry called Phenomena for Voice and Tape by Milton Babbitt. Everybody sing along. So that's that. If you heard the term electronic music back in like the late 50s to the early mid 60s, I think that probably is what you would have thought about. And it's not music that ever found an extremely large audience, but they were, however. Some of those places were Bob Moog's earliest and probably most important customers, because in those places, particularly in the academic institutions where they were doing this kind of research, these were the places where early versions of Bob's technology, Bob's systems went, and where the bugs were actually worked out by actual performers. So that's the end of digression. But so electronic music was kind of a strange place at that time. All right, so next topic. We're going to talk about a little bit about the physics of sound and a little bit about how sound gets from one place to another and how it gets produced. And those of you, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a physicist. So I'll ask those of you in the audience who are to give me a little bit of rope. I'll probably stretch, misuse, and otherwise simplify some things in order to tell this story. But basically, this transduction, and I'll come to what that means in a minute, but what I'm really kind of focusing on here is how sound gets created, is the first part of the story. So, transduction. I think almost every discussion that I have heard, I've heard every teacher who started talking about sound always seemed to want to start with a picture that looked like that. Right, so you've got a still pond, a droplet of water drops into the middle of it, creating waves and ripples in the surface, which then propagate or radiate out from the center. And I think they show you that because not only does that offer a nice illustration of how sound works in the atmosphere, but the things that it produces, as we see later, the things that we'll be talking about are actually waves. So I think the example has the advantage of working in a bunch of different ways. Oops. There we are. So as a simple example, to talk about sound, basically, sound is vibrations traveling through a medium, right? Basically, sound is vibrations created in one place, traveling through a medium, and then being met at the other end by a receiving source, right? And I think most of us, when we were kids, did something like this experiment, which we did, the tin can phone experiment, where you get the two soup cans from your mother, you tie a length of string between them. You stand apart, one person talks in one side, you pull it taut, one person talks on one side, the other puts the other side to his ear, and if one person talks in one end, the person on the other end will hear what that other person is saying. And I'll tell you that I did this experiment after I saw it in school at home, and I'll tell you that with two Campbell's soup cans and about 50 feet of nylon fishing line, and a very, very still day, right? You can stand 50 feet apart from your friend and talk in a normal tone of voice, and that friend can hear you at the other end. My buddies and I did that. And I'll tell you that the quality was not, I think, a lot worse than I remember early cell phones to be. I mean, it was recognizable. Obviously, you lost a lot of the detail of the sound, but I was able to understand what he was saying. And we tried various experiments, one of which was to both talk, to talk in both ends at the same time. And neither one of us heard anything, and I think that should have been an object lesson with where politics would end up 50 years hence. So to take this to the more concrete example of sound, now, air is a medium exactly like string, right? So air vibrates just like a string, but not in exactly the same way, but air vibrates. So the air is made up of molecules, right? So the air is a medium, it's filled up with molecules, and a vibration in those molecules, just like the droplet of water in the pond, will create ripples that radiate out, that propagate out over space. And if they meet up with something on the other side that's also capable of vibrating along with those vibrations that occur, that creates sound reception. So, I mean, this diagram, very simple. We have the tuning fork on the left. The tuning fork, when it vibrates, creates disturbances in the air, those vibrations. Those go through the air and they wind up at the ear. And I'm sorry if this seems rather basic, but actually I think there's because I think the example of human hearing maps really nicely onto what we'll talk about later. I'm going to just spend time talking a little bit about stuff that you already know. Oops, I keep wanting to point up there, but that does no good. I better point up there. So here, this of course is the human ear. And so in the previous diagram, the sound comes in through the ear canal, it goes down through and meets up, those vibrations meet up with the eardrum. The eardrum is a thin membrane that vibrates, causing that little series of bones behind it, to those very fine little bones, sensitive bones, to vibrate, which then meets up, those vibrations are passed along to the cochlea, which is a small organ that is filled with liquid and is lined with tiny little follicles like hair. And so those vibrations, as they're transmitted through bones, will vibrate the side of the cochlea, and those vibrations then are radiated out through the liquid inside there, much like in the liquid in the pond. And each one of those hairs is sensitive to particular frequencies or sounds. And so those little hairs, or those little follicles, are all attached eventually to the vestibular, to the cochlear nerve, and are passed down, and they're processed by the cochlea. They're passed to the cochlear nerve, where they then travel as essentially electrical signals into your brain, and are received by your conscious mind as sound. Right? It's actually a pretty magical thing when you think about it. Right? We're taking a physical vibration, and we're going through a process of turning it into essentially an electrical signal. Right? The process of taking energy and changing it, usefully changing it, I love that. When I read that, I love the fact that I think they put useful. Yeah, you. No, I guess I must have been looking at it. I'm thinking of a different definition. I looked up one definition that said usefully converts. I don't know if that one says it or not, but I thought useful was the key. But anyway, so a transducer is something that converts one form of energy to another. So in the case of the ear is a transducer, it turns vibrational energy, right, from the air into essentially electrical energy, which then goes into your brain. And as I said, produces sound. And this idea of transduction is a very powerful one. You can actually have, obviously, a transducer that goes the opposite direction. You can have a transducer that converts electrical energy into sound, into vibrations, which is called an amplifier. Essentially, it's an electrical transducer circuit that takes electrical pulses and turns them into noise, into sound. So there's some just examples of some, I guess, two transducer systems throughout history. All of these are two-part, meaning they have one input. I call it an input transducer, which takes the vibrations and an output transducer and turns them into electricity, and an output transducer, which transforms electricity back into sound. The first one, maybe the oldest one, the electrical one anyway, is the telegraph, which the energy that it is converting is the energy that you're created by tapping up and down on the key. It transmits that over a wire of potentially great length. And at the other end, tries to replicate the same motion on the telegraph key. The old style ones didn't produce beeps out of speakers the way the current ones do. They actually created the same clicks on the telegraph station on the other side. So it's a transducer. And the important thing about most of these transducers that we're looking at is these two transducer systems are designed to take the message from one place to another without really changing it. In other words, we want to make sure that what I tap here is the same thing that comes out on the other side. The telephone is another really obvious one, right? The input transducer is the speaker, is the speaker, and the receiver is the output transducer. And again, the object there is to replicate what I'm saying here right now to someplace maybe tens or hundreds of miles away. So the idea there is to preserve the content of the signal that came in, of the vibrations that came in. And a final example, which we're obviously demonstrating in real time now, is a PA system, and it's the same thing, but instead of just being designed to replicate at the output what came in at the input, a public address system actually seeks to modify the vibrations that came in this case just to make them louder, to make them hearable a greater distance away. So this is another thing, if you have a system with an input transducer and an output transducer, it can try to replicate the other side, but it can also try to modify. And most public address systems have things that allow you to modify the bass or the treble, or add other sorts of effects or clarifications or fixes to the sound. So this idea of once you've turned something to electricity, running it through a current, and then allowing other things to modify it is something that's going to be really important later on. I think what's really interesting is to kind of look at, now there's another kind of two transducer system, and that is one that doesn't make any effort to move the to replicate the content, but that takes in the input and then does something completely different with it, and then spits out something completely different on the other side. And I think the finest example of this is, to return to the example, is the human body. Right? Our input transducer is the ear, so vibrations come into the ear. Those vibrations are converted to electrical currents, which go to the brain. Our brain hears the sound, and then we think about it. And then we pass that information to the other transducer that we have in our body, which is namely, and it's a much more larger complex system, which consists of our lungs, our diaphragm, our trachea, our vocal cords, in fact, even like our mouth, our tongue, the teeth, the nose. That basically that we're all one big output transducer. So we take that information that's come into the brain, we act on it, and then in response to that, we produce vibrations in the air through our voices. So in a way, we're we're biological transducers to transducer systems. Okay, so we've talked about getting sound from one place to another, about transmission, how about sound is transmitted, what it is. So let's talk about the next thing. Now let's say, for example, now we've been talking about two transducer systems, right? So the truth is that once something becomes electricity, we no longer really need the input. And in fact, we don't really need the input transducer at all, right? So imagine if we took that public address system and we removed the microphone and we created an electrical circuit that itself creates the electrical signal that will create sound, that will pass through to the output transducer, to the amplifier, to create sound. So the only input, there is no input to the system. All the sounds are generated by electrical circuits which are within that system. In order to do that, we need some kind of electrical circuit that will produce those electrical waves, for lack of a better term, those electrical waves that can be sent to the amplifier and then returned as vibration and sound at the other end. And that is called an oscillator. One way to do that is something called an oscillator. So an oscillator. So actually, let me not start there. What you see in that diagram there is a sine wave, is a picture of a sound, and you'll see that it bears an uncanny resemblance to a side kind of a side cut through of what the ripples in the waves would look like. So this is what a sound wave looks like. And the sine wave oscillates, it goes back and forth, it represents voltage, it goes back and forth through that line, through the time axis, which is in the middle there. And there are a few parts to that. There is the period, which is the length of time it takes for the wave to go all the way up, all the way down, and all the way back up again and meet the timeline, meet the x-axis. It consists of the frequency, which is the number of times in a particular time interval, usually a second, the number of times that particular waveform occurs. So the higher the frequency, the more of those up and down, those hill-valley curves you'll see. Or maybe another way to look at it is the narrower the distance will be between the start and the beginning of the curve. And then the amplitude, which is the distance from the x-axis, from that middle line to the top of the curve, either above or below, with the voltage either positive or negative. So the frequency is what your brain perceives as pitch, right? So the rapidity with which that wave is created within a fixed period of time will determine what the pitch is. They talk about A440. If you're a musician, you've heard A440, right? That 440 is what describes the number of times, the number of thousands of times that that wave is created within a second. So the frequency determines the pitch to you, and the amplitude is perceived by us as volume, is how loud the sound is. So these two things together, frequency and amplitude, go together to determine how a pitch sounds to us, or how something sounds to us. Now, a sine wave is a very simple form of sound. It's a very pure form of sound. We'll talk a little bit more about different kinds of waves later on. But I think the important thing is to realize that the waves that are accepted by the input transducer as vibrations are converted by the transducer into electrical currents that have waves that look like that. So really, the germ, the atom of sound, are these sine waves, are these sound waves. So, as I said, a sine wave is a very pure sound. Give me a second here, let me just play one for you. One of the things you'll notice about a sine wave, whoops, did I lose my Bluetooth connection? Oh, I'm sorry, my speaker turned off. Oops, no, that's not a sine. There. That's a sine wave. And one thing you'll notice about it is it's very pure. It's also kind of boring. I mean, it doesn't really sound like any musical instrument you've ever heard. It doesn't really sound like sounds in nature. I mean, it's a pure tone. But things in the real world have more complicated sound waves associated with them. And I don't have samples for these, but I picked a couple of things just to show you. We have underneath that we have a flute waveform. Now, when a musical instrument, like a wind instrument, like a flute, plays, right, there isn't just one thing vibrating, right? In the case of like a sound wave is produced by an oscillator that has usually a quartz crystal or something similar to it inside that vibrates at exactly one frequency at a time, and that's why you hear that purity of sound. But when I play a flute, for example, different parts of the flute vibrate in different ways, at different frequencies. So when I play the flute, you don't just hear the tone, you don't just hear the pitch. You hear a lot of other sounds behind it. You hear that kind of breathiness, or the particular tone that makes the flute sound like a flute. And so you see that the waveform associated with a constant flute note is underneath there. And I picked a stringed instrument as another one. Guitars and violins, for example, stringed instruments also do not vibrate at a single frequency. So a guitar string, when you pluck it, vibrates first of all at its intended frequency, which is the entire string vibrates, but also the string vibrates in halves, but it generates additional vibrations in halves, and in fourths, and in eighths, and in sixteenths, all creating different, they're called overtones, that contribute to the unique sound that makes a guitar sound like a guitar. Right? So the waveforms in nature that we hear, even though they can be periodic, are not as neat and clean looking as sine waves, but sine waves are really sort of the atoms out of which a lot of the other, all the other sounds are built. So I mentioned a few minutes ago about overtones. And this diagram shows the sine wave at the top, which you saw, and the bottom diagram shows essentially what happened if we turn that graph 90 degrees. So there's what the graph below shows is the frequencies that are present in that sine wave. Okay, and you'll see that the sine waves up there, you see there's really just one. There's one tall thing there. So that sine wave has one frequency in it, which is the tune frequency of the wave itself. And that's why, as I said, that's why it has that very kind of pure character. This, on the other hand, is a viola playing an open C. And if you look at that, you can see the waveform at the top, but underneath, when you see the frequency diagram, you can see that there are all sorts of frequencies present in that. Now, there's one that's a little bit larger than all the rest. You'll see in the middle, and that's C, right? That's the note, the C that the viola is playing, or the viola is playing. But all those other frequencies are there as well. All those other overtones are playing at the same time, but at lower volume. And it's those overtones which kind of fill in and make a viola sound like a viola instead of like a sine wave. And so we'll come to this idea later of of managing, they're called the harmonics, of managing the harmonics in a waveform or a sound, because it really is kind of a key part of how Robert Moog's vision of synthesis actually ended up working. So I put this up here just to kind of demonstrate. So what we have right now, where we started with was essentially an amplifier kind of circuit or a transmission circuit where we have input turning to power and going output, which basically replicated what was the input. And now we have the synthesizer, which begins with an oscillator. DC power powers the oscillator, and the oscillator produces the output signal, which then goes to this. It's a conceptual diagram of what a synthesizer looks like versus the kind of two transducer systems we were talking about earlier. So I mentioned there are different kinds of waves, right, which are all producible by oscillators. And here are some common ones. The sine wave, obviously, the one you've seen on top. A square wave. And let's see, let me play you what a square wave sounds like. So what you hear with that, so here's the sine. And here's the square wave. So what you hear in that, it's a square wave has only the odd harmonics in it. Okay, so it sounds a little fatter, it has a little bit more maybe resonance, a little bit more heft to it, I guess, than a sine wave. But it's still, I mean, as a standard periodic wave, I think it's still not musically all that interesting. There is a triangle wave. Which has fewer harmonics than the than the square wave does. I'm sorry?
How's it compared to the sine?
Oh, you want to hear it? Oh, sure. Yeah, a second. So here. There's sine. So it's not as raw sounding as the square wave. And that's because it's less rich in harmonics. So you can see like those high points kind of correspond to harmonics. You can see in the square wave, you have the peaks and troughs, but they're discrete. In other words, whereas in the triangle they're smooth, and there are about half as many high points in the same amount of sound, in the same wavelength. So it's a less, I guess, a less raw or sharper sound than the square wave is. And then finally, I think what is probably the most frequently used wave in synthesis, at least in the Moog synthesizers, is a sawtooth wave. Again, let's sine wave and sawtooth. So there's sawtooth versus square. And the sawtooth wave is the richest in harmonics, right? And as it turns out, music synthesis is going to be a lot like sculpture, right? In sculpture, we start out with a big block of rock, and we carve chunks away from it until it looks like something we recognize. And what you'll see is when we start talking about music synthesis is that's exactly what Bob Moog came up with. The idea is that we're going to start, instead of starting with recordings or natural sounds, whatever, we start out with harmonically rich, machine creatable, oscillator creatable waveforms. And then we carve chunks out of them. We filter chunks out of them to produce new and completely and for now unknown sounds. So actually, I should have flipped to this diagram. I'm sorry. This kind of covers what I was just talking about, but let me go over it anyway. What this shows on the left are the waveforms, and on the right it shows the harmonic content, the frequencies present. And I'm sorry, I meant to go. I should have been on this one, gone to this one. So on the top you see the sine wave. You see just one frequency. You see the square wave, and you see basically every other harmonic, every odd harmonic is included in that. Then you look at the sawtooth wave below, and you see there are twice as many harmonics. So most synthesizing is based on starting with either a box, or sometimes it's called a pulse wave. And it's called a pulse wave because if you play it, it can sound, because it looks like a pulse. So a square wave, or or it begins with a sawtooth wave, one of those two, and then removes harmonics from those in order to produce the sounds that come out that are used to create the music. So one other thing about sound I haven't talked about yet, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but sounds, like everything else in nature, have a lifetime, right? They don't last forever. And sounds in nature obviously especially don't. And with musical instruments especially, there's not a single musical instrument I can really think of where you get, where you get this. So it just plays forever at the same tone, at the same volume, with the same character. The same timbre, I guess. Timbre is the word I really want to use. The same timbre. So musical instruments, the sound a musical instrument makes has a lifetime. It has a life cycle. And the kind of life cycle it has will depend on the kind of instrument it is. So I press a piano key, you hear an initial attack when I press the key, and if you leave the sustain, if you press down the sustain pedal and press the key, you'll hear the sound will slowly trail off. And if you listen carefully, it'll somewhat change character and timbre as the vibrations in the string die out, right? So, a piano strike looks like this. When you play an instrument that produces a continuous tone, like for example a clarinet or a violin, even when you're doing that, it's not possible for a person's breath to be absolutely the same all the time. In fact, it's not desirable. There are effects like vibrato and things like that that wind musicians produce. The same thing with violin. You simply cannot produce one sustained tone that sounds the same all the time, and you wouldn't want to. It seems all the way through. So all of those also have different sort of life cycles associated with them. So we refer to this in the music synthesis area as an envelope, right? We call the lifetime of a musical event, of a sonic event, right? We call that an envelope in terms of its volume. And the diagram that I have up there kind of shows you the general structure. It was kind of an innovation of Moog himself to divide up it exactly this way. And again, I keep saying this, but we'll see later how this kind of factors into his design. So they divide up the lifetime of sound into attack, which is the initial. And the interesting thing about attack, and I didn't really appreciate this, I should have brought a sound sample for this, I didn't think about it. But in experiments they determined is that if you took common musical instruments and sounds and you cut off the attack and played them for people, that oftentimes they had a hard time knowing exactly what the instrument was without the attack. You think of the attack as being this one, possibly, this one kind of transitory moment at the very start of the musical sound. You don't think of it as contributing a great deal to the overall sound itself. But as it turns out that people have a hard time identifying the sources of sounds, often without the attack. So we have the attack, decay, which this is like the case of a keyboard instrument, for example. You have decay, which is after you initially strike it, the string or whatever is vibrating starts winding down its vibration. You have sustain. So if I am playing a piano, that's a bad example. So sustain, if I'm playing a wind instrument, there really is not a decay unless you introduce one. So you could blow hard and then draw back. But the sustain is how long the note lasts. This shows it as a straight line, but honestly, in real music performance, it's almost never actually a straight line. And then finally, release, which is the amount of time it takes from the time you stop producing the note until it actually stops. So, a piano, for example, has attack, and decay and release are really, if you have the sustain pedal down, you have an attack, and then you have decay and release kind of are all the same phase of a piano strike. Whereas if I were playing clarinet, for example, I might, if I'm doing staccato, the attack would come with my tongue against the reed. The decay might come from the initial decrease in velocity of my breath when it comes from the kind of and kind of settles into a sustaining breath. And then the release would essentially be no release. It would stop the minute I stopped actually blowing on it. So anyway, so this is an envelope, and it's basically the motion of the sound over time. And this will be another thing that It has an important role in defining what synthesized sound sounds like. All right, so I'm just going to take a second to ask, are there any questions? Because I'm going to move into yes.
Hang on, could you wait for the microphone?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Well, we're all together. I can probably. Oh, they want them on the recording.
Okay, I was just wondering, now I've lost some sound in the lower range in my ear, and I know that it was described to me that when the hairs start to lay down and age, I know a lot of people here my age maybe feel that way. I could not tell the difference between the sine and the sawtooth, and I'm wondering if that's part of the reason, or if it's so subtle that no one can.
You know, I think that's actually really fascinating. And the answer is I don't know the answer to your question. I don't know enough about either physiology, but I'm going to look into that. That's a very fascinating question.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
When the violin is played, I know you do the vibrato, and so are you changing when you do that? It's still the same note, but it's still changing the length of the wave, maybe.
Right. Yeah. Actually, you're correct. I think the way I said it wasn't exactly right. Vibrato, you're actually changing the pitch. You're changing the frequency. You're not really changing the waveform. That's correct. Although your motion on the strings is also affecting the strings' motion, which might also affect the waveform as well.
Okay.
But you are correct in saying that vibrato is a change in frequency, and not a change in not the kind of change that I was talking about.
Okay. I was just wondering. Okay.
But thank you. That's actually a really good research question.
I have another question.
Can I do a follow-up to that one?
Hang on, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as we age, as you said, we hear less and less of the high frequencies. So that's really, forgive the pun, an analog to what you were going to start talking about filters. I'm getting ahead of it here.
You're filtering.
I'm being a know-it-all, but you're basically taking out all those other frequencies. Right. You said you lost the lower range? I'm sorry, I wasn't listening properly. I guess I have hearing problems too. I think that's in my brain, though, not my ears. But yeah, but it's still kind of a filtering thing. Yeah.
No, actually, when you're thinking about it, because each one of those follicles is sensitive to a particular frequency, you are doing exactly what a synthesizer does.
Yeah, it's still a good
What you're doing
segue
is you're
into
removing, by having those follicles cease working, you're removing certain frequencies from the waveform.
Yeah.
So you are exactly doing it.
No, they break. They literally break off.
As the physician in the group, you're most likely to lose high frequency first. It's the most likely to go because the length of the hair cells, right?
Okay. That makes sense. Well, see, this is why I do this, so I can learn stuff.
I have another question.
Yeah.
If I have an eighth note, a quarter note, a half note, because the lengths of the notes are different, that gives different harmonics to those notes, right?
So I'm not sure that so in the case of an actual world sound, which does evolve, a sound produced by a natural source like a flute or something, the waveform would vary with time. And so I think what you're saying is correct. I think that a longer note would have a slightly different waveform or a series of waveforms. I showed you the picture of the flute waveform, and what was wrong about that was it was perfectly regular. Remember, I mean, there were a bunch of odd-looking waves, but they were periodic. They were both. But the truth is that if I'd really played a flute into an oscilloscope, you would have seen a lot more variation between each individual wave as it was going through, because. Right. But if I were using a synthesizer, for example, to produce a sound that did not have temporal evolution, right, that did not change over time, that just produced the same tone over time, then there would not be any difference between a half note or a quarter note. You'd be producing exactly the same sound, but for a different period of time. Did that make sense? Or?
Yeah. So if I play a sine note for a tenth of a second or half a second,
right.
Start it and stop it, but you get extra overtones of half a hertz or tenth of a hertz.
Well, actually, no, so if you could make your notes small enough, to the point where you were overlapping individual waveforms, and I think, but the fact is they happen so quickly that even over a tenth of a second, you get thousands of them there.
Okay,
That kind of clipping. But yeah, it's
in principle.
all right. So I'm gonna move away from science for a moment and talk about Bob Moog. So Bob Moog was a physicist. I mean, actually, he had degrees in physics. He has a PhD in physics, I guess. He was an engineer. He was a inveterate tinkerer. I guess today, in this day and age, we call him a maker. Are you familiar with that term? In the technology arena, there's kind of a culture built around people who are home building their own kind of technologically complex systems, and it's called being a maker. There's a magazine devoted to that particular hobby. But today he would be called a maker. But also a man who had, as I said, a passion for music. I think he was a very unique individual. And we'll talk a little bit about how he grew up and how he got into doing what he was doing. So Bob was born in Queens, New York. Grew up in Queens, New York. Bob Moog. He had his parents were George and Sherlina, who married fairly young. His father was an electrical engineer who worked for Con Edison in New York City. His mother was a piano teacher who, when she was young, had considered a career as a musician, as a pianist, and who actively taught both Bob as well as a lot of his friends and other folks in the neighborhood in Queens how to play the piano. So Bob was the product of a musician and an engineer. But the other thing about his father, about George, is that George was a tinkerer. George, he was an engineer at work during the day, but in every house they lived in, there was a room in the basement that was his workshop, and he was constantly building stuff, and he was mad about electronics, about electrical things. And so he had in his lab in the basement, his workshop in the basement, he was constantly building things. And Bob, from an early age, was down there with him and picked up that same interest in fiddling around and in making electronic devices. They spent during the years that Bob was growing up in the house with them, they spent hours, to the point where it annoyed his mother. Dinner was over and down they went. And even when George was in elementary school and in high school, I think he picked up the physics and the engineering from his father. He was one of the top students in his high school class. He was identified for his very high level of advancement and kind of beyond what high school could teach you in physics and mathematics and in engineering. He also, as I said, took piano lessons throughout his childhood, and was good enough that, his mother had at times encouraged him to consider a career as a performing musician. And his father also was a great lover of recorded music and music as well. So while he wasn't a musician himself, he was very much actually, one other interesting thing about George is his father had been a craftsman, a woodworker. And George was also passionate about woodworking in addition to engineering. And any of you who have used Moog devices or have seen Moog synthesizers will notice that they don't arrive in the kind of cheap plastic cabinets that a lot of off-the-shelf synthesizers and things do. And you'll see some pictures of some later. But back in the day, they arrived in really handsome oak and sometimes mahogany cabinets. And those cabinets were all built by hand, by Bob Moog, by his dad, by the folks in his factory, and were used to package their instruments, hold their instruments. So George's interest in music and his interest in electronics comes together in high school. And he hears a performance on the radio which absolutely entrances him. And it sounded like this. So name that instrument?
Theremin.
Theremin, right. That was a theremin. And I don't know if you noticed this. The thing that struck me when I listened to that recording for the first time was when the theremin first comes in, how human voice-like it sounds for that first moment. Here, let me take it back. So listen to the first moment. You can almost hear like a vocalization in that. But then as it goes, that voiciness of it kind of goes away. So the theremin. He heard the theremin, and this idea of a musical instrument with sound produced exclusively through electrical means just captures Bob Moog's imagination. And he and his dad set to work. He and his dad set to work to design and build a theremin. Now, a theremin basically is nothing more than an oscillator, right? Something that produces a wave that sounds kind of sine wave-like. And it's although it's not exact sine wave because it has some character to it, as you heard. There's almost a little vocal character to it. But it's an oscillator that produces that sound, and the musician controls that sound by placing their hands, well, in this case, you'll see, in this case, his hands are above the wood cabinet in the theremin that he's playing. This is one that he built. But this is a more typical, this is Clara Rockwell, the woman who you heard playing just a few moments ago, who is probably the only really well-known theremin musicians in the 50s and 60s. But you can see that there are two antennas on the theremin. There's one that's near her right hand, where her hand is up, and one that is off near her left hand. And the reason they're arrayed like that is if they're too close together, they would interfere with each other. And basically, those two antennas detect the closeness of the hand. They detect how close an object or the hand is to those. And so to control the sound of the theremin with your left hand, the distance from your left hand to the antenna controls the amplitude or volume of the sound. So closer, louder, farther away, softer. And with the right hand, the one that's up in the air like that, that controls the frequency or the pitch that you hear. So if you were to watch her play that, you would see her doing, and unfortunately I can't do video here, but it's almost as if it's funny because she uses her hands like this, almost as if she's playing something. But it's because what it's really detecting is the distance between her furthest finger, the finger that is furthest out, maybe her middle finger, and the antenna. In other words, it's reacting to the closest thing to it. So you see it, but it almost looks like she's plucking something or she's getting ready to pluck something. But she basically, now, I've tried playing with a theremin, and I'll tell you that it is an amazingly hard instrument to play at all. I mean, first of all, as you hear, because the distance between the antenna and your hand is a continuous quantity, you have to learn how to find the notes. And you have to teach your muscle where those notes are. So it's not like a piano where I go B flat, right? I have to remember that that's B flat, or that that's G, or and I have to remember which one because these things are all, they're not arithmetic distances. Well, I'm probably using the wrong term. Let me put it this way: the way the distance to the theremin works is that the frequency changes faster the closer your hand gets to it. So it's not like this is an A, this is a C, a C2, and this is a C4, and this is a C8. It's that the pitches go up faster as you get closer, right? So you have to really learn. I mean, and then at the same time you're doing that, you've got to be managing the volume with this other hand. I think that Clara does a little bit less of the dynamic stuff, but it was a difficult enough instrument to play that in the 50s and 60s, you didn't hear a lot of people doing serious music with a theremin What you did hear it used for are things like are things like scary movies. You know, ooh, we would actually this would have been the thing to have for our for our play today, right? Because during each one of the visitation sequences, ooh. So Bob's first passion was this theremin, and he wanted first of all to make a theremin. Theremins were really expensive back then. I mean, you can see it's a large thing. Back then, you know, they didn't have integrated circuits. They didn't have, it was all done with tubes and full electrical circuit. I mean, it was a big, heavy thing in a cabinet. It was big, and they were very expensive. And they were very difficult to play. So you didn't have a lot of people who were doing serious music on the theremin back then. But what Bob wanted to do was to come up with a way where, like, an ordinary person, and they were also extremely expensive, where an ordinary person could own a theremin. So he and his dad set to work building a theremin, and let me go back to the picture of his. And of course, it wouldn't be a Moog product if it didn't have a handsome oak cabinet. So you can see that. In his, he had antennas on both ends underneath the surface of the wood. And so it was manipulated by doing this kind of an action on his. So he and his dad worked this out. They kind of perfected it. They made a few different versions of this. And while still, he's in high school here, right? I think he's like in 11th grade, 10th or 11th grade when he and his dad do this. He comes with the idea, he and his dad come up with the idea, let's sell these things, right? Now, they're not gonna set up a factory and build theremins, but his idea, you know, because they're active tinkerers, they subscribe to Popular Electronics and all of the electronics magazines, they're builders, and I don't know if this is still true, but back during, even when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, there was an active market for kits. So if you want to get an electronic device like a shortwave radio, for example, was one that we did when I was a kid, you could either pay a lot of money and buy one fully built and ready to go, or you could go to Heathkit or Radio Shack and buy a box that had all the pieces in it, and then you would put it together yourself. And it would cost maybe a third or a quarter of what a fully built model was. And so their idea was that they would get theremins out there by selling kits. So they worked it all out. They worked out the components. They figured out what they needed to do, and they finally ended up with a build-it-yourself theremin kit that they then advertised in a few of these magazines. And they actually started to sell some of them while Bob was still in high school. And the original R.A. Moog Company, as it was called, was created. It wasn't incorporated, but it was registered, I guess, in New York, in order to sell order by mail theremin kits. So they shipped some of these. I don't think they ever really made much of a profit on them, especially not considering the labor that was required to assemble the kits and put things together. But you know, Bob then graduates high school, goes to college. I'll make a very long, complicated story short. Gets married, but all throughout this time, he's thinking to himself while he's working on his dissertation, he keeps thinking, I want to get back to this music thing, right? In fact, he had a hard time finishing his dissertation because he was constantly distracted by the idea of trying to build this theremin business. So he's a married man, graduates from college. He gets a part-time job working at college, and then in upstate New York, he and his wife buy a home up there, and he begins trying to build this business. So it all really begins with the theremin. Now, hang on, let me see one. So when Bob starts, as Bob is thinking about the theremin, I mean, first of all, he realized that even at a low price in a kit, you've got like a doubly restricted market, right? First of all, the theremin is hard to make musical, and B, you have to build it, right? And so these two things together like constrict the market to the point where he realizes he's not going to make a lot of money doing this. So he starts thinking more about music in general, like why don't people play the theremin? It's hard to play. Why doesn't a musician pick up the theremin? Because it's hard to play. And he was also aware of what was going on in the electronic music field. He said, well, why aren't like regular working musicians doing what Morton Subotnick and his buddies are doing? And it's because it's complicated. These guys are soldering, they're fiddling with things. They have tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment that they're working with. I mean, These are not things like a practical gigging musician would generally tend to have. So Bob started thinking to himself, like, how do we take this ability to create sound and put it to the use of practicing musicians? And that kind of is, that's really the Bob Moog miracle in a lot of ways. So, yeah. Oh, is that all I've got? Okay, so we'll go quickly through this. The short version of how Bob came to do what he was going to do, and I'll stop at the bottom of it because this makes this a more rapid thing to explain. But what Bob realized early on, remember earlier we were talking about the various parts of creating sound, right? We have the oscillator to create the music, right? We have filters, right? We talked about in order to take these rich waves and trim sound out of them in order to make them identifiable as interesting sounds. And then the realization that all of these things could be controlled by voltage, right? That instead of having like knobs and switches and dials and these kind of interfaces, you could actually use voltage within the synthesizer, within the circuits, to actually manage other things inside the circuits. And then the fourth thing was modularity, where he takes these three things above that they have, and he breaks the individual synthesizer not into one instrument, but into several pieces that you can use to build a complete synthesizer. And those, so you have an oscillator, you have a filter, you have an amplifier, you have an input, and all those things are separate boxes with their own inputs and outputs. And then once you have that, you can wire them all together any way you want. So what you end up with is this. Now, it's hard, that miracle is not the first thing you think when you see that. I think you think, you know, the phone room in Mad Men, or the Petticoat Junction switchboard panel. But basically, you see each one of the sections of that on that top board. Each one of the sections separated by the next by this silver line is a module. Each one of those really does one thing. So some of them are oscillators, some of them are filters, some of them are amplifiers. We didn't talk about sequencers, but sequencers are things that automatically generate things that are used like key presses, like note generation. So, but each one of those little sections is an individual module or component of the synthesizer. And as you can see, because everything flows with voltage, right? Voltage, which travels over cables, you can see that the way you mix and match and create sounds is by taking those modules and connecting them to each other using those, they're called patch cables. And these days, if you buy a synthesizer or talk to synthesizer people, they talk about the different kinds of sounds that the synthesizer will make, like organ, piano, harp, whatever. They call them patches. And the reason they call them patches is because that's where it started. So in order to, when you plunk that down in your laboratory, like I said earlier, you plug it in, press the keys, nothing happens. Not until you choose some of those modules, you use the cables to move the voltage from one place to another, say from an oscillator to a filter, or from a filter to an amplifier, right? Not until you connect those things and twiddle those knobs in order to get the exact settings you want, the degree of filtration, the frequency of the oscillation, the amplitude of the oscillation, until you've done all of those things, nothing comes out of the synthesizer. And that particular one there, which is the Model 3, it's like the earliest widely used Moog synthesizer, weighed 300 pounds. It cost $10,000 in the early 1960s. And it only played one note at a time. It only played, so today there are some synthesizers that only let you choose one sound type at a time, like piano or whatever, but you can play a chord. In this, you couldn't play a chord. It plays one, and once you do all that work, you get one note out of it. So if you imagine Wendy Carlos in doing Switched on Bach, she had to record those keyboard works, those keyboard inventions, for example, one line at a time. So and I don't play piano, maybe you tell me though, could you easily take like a Beethoven sonata and sit down and play me just one passage on the left hand? Like, I think that must have been amazingly difficult for her. And this was before, computer-controlled sequencers and ways of doing that. She couldn't just give it a MIDI file and have it play it. She actually recorded each one of those things line by line on the Moog synthesizer. But that really is where it started. And the key thing about that was because everything was voltage controlled, you could use a keyboard, and the keyboard really is a selection of switches. You press the key down, the voltage turns on. You lift the key, you lift up the key, the voltage goes off. It's called a gate, right? And then there are also knobs, which are called CVs, which control the voltages. Which, like in the case of an amplifier, I increase the voltage, I increase the volume. Or I increase on an oscillator, I increase the voltage, I increase the frequency. Or on a filter, I increase the voltage, I increase the degree to which I'm filtering. There are different kinds, I don't have time for this, but there are different kinds of modulations you can do in filters, but one might be just carving harmonics out of those rich waves. And there's one switch that does that. So you can imagine when Keith Emerson was on the stage at Wembley, he didn't just go from one Moog synthesizer song on one, or Moog on one song to one on the next, right? It wasn't a matter of, it would take probably 20 minutes between songs to reprogram his. So, when he played the synthesizer, he played it for one number and then somebody else came out. And while he was doing the next number, that person rewired it for the new sound. Because every change you wanted to make in the sound would require all of those things to change.
I found a Moog synthesizer for sale. It's Model 3C, $135,000.
Yeah. So actually that's probably pretty close to what you would have paid for it then in new dollars.
That was $125,000 for the recording.
You'd still need to get a U-Haul to move it. So really, it's when you think about now through the years at Moog, what they did was since Bob Moog's vision was to bring this kind of technology to working musicians, and there were a lot of working musicians who did this, but a lot of these things were in studios or labs. But as time went on, the Moog factory focused on trying to make these things both more portable, less expensive, and most importantly, more easily usable by working musicians. And I guess that's probably a better picture. I should have switched that. But that gives you a better view of what the front of the Moog 3 looked like. I thought that the living room organ my aunt and uncle had was complicated with all those stops on it. So this, just as an example of where they ended up going, this was one of the very first really portable Moog synthesizers, and you can actually see that he's kind of, if you look at the top, it's divided into sections that basically kind of capture the modular flow from oscillators across to amplifiers. So the musician even though the musician doesn't need to use patch cables to create these connections, you'll see there are some rows of switches, the blue column of switches and the orange column of switches. Those are basically like cables, right? So in other words, the switch is on off, the pathway is closed, the switch is on, it's open. So those give you the effect of what the cables were providing in the earlier one. But this particular synthesizer was one of the first really portable, widely used Moog units. Actually, one of the other interesting things, well, I'll get to that in a second. How many minutes do I have left? Okay, so I'm going to bypass my talk about digital versus analog and just say for a second one of the interesting things. So briefly, digital versus analog. Analog music, analog synthesis is done by continuously passing electricity through computer circuits. The sound is generated by the motion of the electricity through the computer circuits. In digital, you have a computer that in essence creates a rapid series of numbers that are fed to what's called a digital analog converter, and those are converted to sound. But the important thing is that they are individual numbers that are passed through a computer to a sound generator, and not electrical current creating the sound in the amplifier. And what that means, among other things, is that because it's a series of numbers, it's always the same. In other words, if I can do a digital signal, and it's exactly the same every time. It's a series of numbers. Because it's a series of numbers, I can do what's called a checksum and make sure that even if the numbers are changed, I know it. But analog synthesis is a purely physical process, right? Which means that an analog synthesizer is a prey to environmental conditions and other things, unlike a digital synthesizer. And one of the early challenges of the Moog equipment, particularly on rock and roll tours, where the equipment is bumped around a lot, is that, for example, the frequency at which a Moog synthesizer was playing could change in response to changes in the temperature around it. And Rick Wakeman of the prog rock band Yes tells a great story about how he's in the middle. Yeah, I think he was playing a mini Moog, which is the successor to this, which was purely analog. He was playing that on a day when it had been brought out onto the stage and hadn't had a chance to sit out and come up to temperature. I think it was a cold evening outside. The stage was warm, but they were late and they had to get started. And he's playing through a solo, and he suddenly realizes that the pitch is slowly falling until it had fallen, I know, close, I guess, a full half step. So he's having to like adjust his solo as the pitch of a synthesizer was changing. And even now, if you buy a Moog synthesizer, even now, a Moog analog synthesizer, they will tell you not to perform unless it's been sitting out, turned on in the current environment for 15 to 20 minutes, because those analog circuits are just.
Can you summarize?
So I'm going to skip this, but just to show you, when I was talking about digitization, right? There's the wave, and you see what we basically do is instead of sending a wave, we're sending numbers which represent the distance between the time axis, the center, and the top of the wave. So that's what digitization of sound is. Yes.
Hang on.
I'm sorry?
Do you have a picture of the current digital synthesizer?
Oh no, I don't. But I'll tell you.
I just was curious.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I did not bring. But they look very similar. And they're all knobs and switches and dials. And so that's it. So thank you very much. That was fun.
That was fascinating. We could go on longer, but we really should stop. But one or two questions we've got time for quickly.
Yes, sir.
Glenn.
Has any theremin player ever switched to a trombone?
Actually, interestingly, I grew up with a trombone player. Actually, his dad was a trombone professor at Central Michigan University, and he was a trombone player who switched to synthesizer. But no.
Okay. Well, I guess a question I might have is that when I think of like synthetic music, I generally associate it with like older video games.
Yeah.
So I guess is this kind of history, did that transition into being used in like video game consoles and cabinets?
Yeah, actually, a lot of the technology on which the synthesis of music done in video games is done with essentially the same circuitry, probably more compact and maybe slightly simplified as what Bob developed for that process. I mean, the model he has for sound creation, for digital sound creation, really was adopted by almost every technology that used digital sound as part of it. So on the inside, that music that you're hearing, those sounds are being created through the same kinds of processes, and probably can be divided up into the same module chunks as the Moog synthesizer ones. But yeah, that's probably as vital an area of computer music in a lot of circles as anything else, as the music designed for video games.
I think we have to wrap up now, but if you have, because of the video and so on, we can't go on too long, but if you have questions, let's thank Steve again and come up and have.
Thank you.